On August 15, 2021, the Taliban walked into Kabul. 20 years of American military presence, $2 trillion in US spending, 300,000 trained Afghan security forces, and the government collapsed in 11 days. The last US military transport lifted off from Kabul airport on August 30th. By then, the financial response was already in motion. The United States froze $9.5 billion in Afghan central bank reserves, the entirety of Afghanistan's foreign currency holdings, most of it sitting in Federal Reserve accounts in New York. The International Monetary Fund halted $450 million in emergency funding. The World Bank froze $600 million in development grants. The European Union suspended all direct financial support. Within 2 weeks of the Taliban takeover, Afghanistan was cut off from every major source of international finance simultaneously. The economic forecasts that followed were uniform. The World Bank predicted Afghanistan's GDP would contract by 20 to 30% within a year. The UN warned of mass starvation. Western economists projected that without access to its central bank reserves, the Afghan government would be unable to pay civil servants, maintain basic services, or prevent a complete currency collapse. The Afghan Afghani had already lost 30% of its value in the weeks following the takeover. The assumption underneath all of these forecasts was the same, that the Taliban needed the Western financial system to function. That without access to SWIFT, without correspondent banking, without IMF disbursements and World Bank grants, a government could not survive. That assumption was wrong. 4 years later, the Taliban government is generating an estimated $2 to $3 billion per year in revenue. It has not collapsed. It has not moderated. It has not come to the negotiating table on Western terms. It has built a functioning, if brutal, state economy using financial channels that no sanctions regime was designed to touch. The first and most obvious revenue stream is the one the Taliban inherited from their previous government: drugs. Afghanistan produces approximately 80% of the world's illicit opium, the raw material for heroin. Under the previous Afghan government, the Taliban taxed poppy farmers and drug traffickers operating in territory they controlled, generating an estimated $400 million per year even while they were an insurgency. When they took control of the entire country, those revenues did not disappear. They expanded. But here is where the story becomes more complicated than most coverage acknowledges. In April 2022, less than a year after taking power, the Taliban Supreme Leader Hibatullah Akhundzada issued a decree banning opium cultivation nationwide. Western observers initially interpreted this as a gesture toward international legitimacy, a signal that the Taliban wanted to be taken seriously as a governing authority. The more credible interpretation is financial. At the time of the ban, the Taliban held enormous stockpiles of opium accumulated over years of taxing the trade. A ban on new cultivation would cause prices to spike, because existing supply would become scarce. Analysts at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime estimated that opium prices increased by over 900% in the 2 years following the ban. The Taliban's existing stockpiles, suddenly worth 10 times what they had been, were sold into a market starved of supply. And simultaneously a different drug was rising to fill the gap. Afghanistan has become one of the world's leading producers of methamphetamine, synthesized from ephedra, a plant that grows across the Afghan highlands. Crystal meth does not require the same seasonal cultivation cycle as opium. It can be produced year-round, is more compact than heroin, and commands comparable margins. The Taliban taxes its production and export as they taxed opium, not as a moral endorsement, but as a revenue line. The drug economy, however, is not what makes the Taliban's financial position genuinely durable. What makes it durable is what is underground. Afghanistan sits on an estimated $1 to $3 trillion in untapped mineral resources: lithium, copper, iron ore, rare earth elements, gold, chromite. The US Geological Survey mapped these deposits extensively during the occupation and concluded that Afghanistan may hold the world's largest lithium reserves, the mineral that every electric vehicle battery on Earth currently depends on. The Taliban cannot access Western capital markets to develop these resources. No Western mining company will operate in Taliban-controlled territory. No Western bank will finance extraction projects. But there is one major economy that has decided those constraints do not apply to it: China. In January 2023, the Taliban signed a 25-year extraction agreement with Capiac, a Chinese state-affiliated oil company, to develop the Amu Darya oil basin in northern Afghanistan. The deal gives China access to an estimated 87 million barrels of recoverable oil in exchange for royalties paid directly to the Taliban government. In 2024, MCC China Metallurgical Group began moving toward reactivating the Mes Aina copper mine project, the largest copper deposit in Asia, after a contract originally signed in 2008 with the previous Afghan government lay dormant for 15 years. China's calculation is straightforward. Afghanistan has minerals China needs for its manufacturing economy. The Taliban has no other major buyers. This creates leverage that Beijing is willing to use quietly without diplomatic recognition, without the press releases that would invite Western criticism. China does not need to formally recognize the Taliban government to do business with it. Beyond drugs and minerals, the Taliban has built a conventional taxation system that functions because Afghanistan's geography makes it unavoidable. Afghanistan sits at the crossroads of trade routes connecting Central Asia, China, Iran, and Pakistan. Every truck carrying goods between these markets either crosses Afghan territory or adds thousands of kilometers to its journey. The Taliban taxes every border crossing, every transit route, every commercial vehicle entering or leaving the country. Estimates from the UN and regional analysts put customs and transit revenues at $400 million or more per year, reliable, recurring, and completely outside any Western sanctions framework. On top of customs, the Taliban operates a domestic taxation system covering markets, agricultural produce, business licenses, property, and telecommunications. They have even taxed international NGOs and aid organizations operating in Afghanistan, effectively levying a fee on the humanitarian assistance that Western governments send precisely because they feel guilty about the population's suffering. It is a tax on Western guilt, collected in cash, invisible to any sanctions regime. But the mechanism that makes all of this work, the infrastructure that moves Taliban money across borders, pays suppliers, and converts revenue into usable assets, is not a bank. It is not a payment network. It is not anything that the architects of modern financial sanctions designed their tools to address. It is the Hawala system. Hawala is an informal value transfer network that predates the modern banking system by centuries. The mechanics are simple. A sender in Kabul gives cash to a Hawala broker, called a Hawaladar, and states an amount, and a recipient in, say, Dubai. The Kabul Hawaladar contacts his counterpart in Dubai by phone or encrypted message. The Dubai Hawaladar pays the recipient from his own funds. No money crosses a border, no SWIFT message is sent, no correspondent bank processes a transaction. The debt between the two Hawaladars is settled later through commodity trades, gold transfers, or reverse transactions. Instead, the Taliban does not use Hawala because they cannot access banks. They use Hawala because it is faster, cheaper, more private, and more reliable than any formal financial system in the Afghan context. The Hawala network connecting Kabul, Dubai, Karachi, Istanbul, and Tehran processes billions of dollars per year for legitimate commerce, remittances, and trade finance. Taliban transactions move through the same channels, indistinguishable from the merchant next door. The United States has spent 20 years trying to disrupt Hawala networks. It has made essentially no progress. There is no central system to sanction. There is no server to seize. There is no company to freeze. The Hawaladar in Kabul is a man with a phone and a reputation built over decades. You cannot sanction a reputation. Meanwhile, the $9.5 billion in frozen reserves sits in legal limbo that nobody knows how to resolve. In 2022, the Biden administration split the frozen funds. $7 billion remained blocked in the Federal Reserve, and $3.5 billion was transferred to a Swiss-based trust called the Afghan Fund, theoretically accessible for humanitarian purposes but operationally frozen because no one can agree on conditions for release. The funds sit in interest-bearing accounts, growing slowly, serving no one. The Taliban has demanded the money unconditionally. Western governments have demanded governance concessions on girls' education, on press freedom, on human rights that the Taliban has no intention of making. The standoff has no resolution mechanism. The money will likely remain frozen indefinitely, earning interest that no one can touch, in a trust established to solve a problem that the parties involved have no shared interest in solving. So what does all of this tell us? The Taliban has exposed a specific and significant gap in the Western sanctions architecture, one that was always there but rarely tested so directly. Financial sanctions work by cutting a target off from the formal global financial system. They work on Russia because Russia has a formal financial system deeply integrated with Western infrastructure. They work on Iran, imperfectly, but they work because Iran has formal banks, formal currency markets, and formal trade relationships that can be disrupted. They work on individuals because individuals have bank accounts, credit cards, and assets registered under their names in jurisdictions that enforce Western law. The Taliban's economy was never meaningfully integrated with the Western financial system in the first place. There was no formal system to cut them off from. The Afghan banking sector was small, largely aid-dependent, and primarily used by urban professionals who have since fled the country. The rural economy, where the vast majority of Afghans live and where Taliban revenue is generated, operated on cash, barter, and hawala long before 2021 and continues to do so today. Sanctioning a country that does not depend on your financial system is not a financial weapon. It is an embargo, and embargoes historically hurt civilian populations far more than the governments that impose them. The Taliban understood this. When Kabul fell, they did not panic about the frozen reserves. They began collecting taxes, signing mining deals, and moving money through hawala networks that the US Treasury had spent 20 years failing to shut down. 4 years later, the prediction of collapse looks like what it always was, a projection based on the assumption that the Taliban needed the West. They did not. They needed minerals, transit routes, and a phone network. China provided the capital. Geography provided the trade revenue. Hawala provided the financial infrastructure. The $9.5 billion remains frozen. The Taliban remains in power, and the gap in the Western sanctions architecture remains open, waiting for the next government that knows how to use it.